I don't think it's a controversial statement to say that out of all the Xeno armies, orcs are probably the ones that get the best treatment. When I think of the Xeno factions in 40k, the first one my mind goes to is always orcs. It might just be because orcs are one of the armies that I play, but I think of them in the same way I think of Space Marines, poster boys for a faction. For my money, the most iconic matchup in 40k will always be Space Marines versus orcs. It's a great way to show both the sci-fi and fantasy influence that runs throughout Warhammer. Compared to other armies, orcs also get new models fairly regularly. I know that's hilarious, considering orcs and Drukhari are the only members left in the waiting for the range update club, but really, orcs have it fairly good compared to a lot of other factions. Certainly the only thing they got for 10th edition was the big mech and some units moved to Legends, but keep in mind that orcs have had some fairly big overhauls in the last 2 codex releases. 8th edition added 5 new buggies to the orc range, and 9th edition added a brand new way to play orcs with the new Beast Snagga units. Beast Snaggas aren't radically different, but it's nice to have the choice between playing Green Mad Max or Unga Bunga Kill Twink with Rock. Their codices have more or less also been pretty good. While I haven't gotten my hands on it yet, their 10th edition codex has been really well received, with Goonhammer saying that it may actually be too good. Sure, their 9th edition codex wasn't great, but it was far from being the worst in the game, but their 8th edition codex was pretty good, and it had one of my favorite rules in it, Daka Daka Daka, which I would really like it if it came back Games Workshop. Please? This isn't even getting into the Black Library books that they've had. Brutal Cunnin is a fantastic book that is able to encapsulate both the brutal and comedic side of the orcs without it ever feeling out of balance. And while I haven't read it, I've also heard really good things about Nate Crowley's Gazskull book as well, and it's on my list of things to read. There's also the Beast Arises series, which is a really interesting idea. Damn shame about the execution, though. But in my opinion, the best treatment that orcs have gotten recently is in video games. Orcs have been present in basically every single 40k game since the very beginning with Space Crusade, and they've pretty much never left, as they're fairly prominent in a lot of other 40k games as well, but never really as the central focus. Usually they've been sharing billing across several other 40k factions like they do in Dawn of War, but that's been changing a bit recently. Orcs have started to get their own games with them as the main focus and playable faction. There's only really 3 of them, but hey, it's more than the Eldar have. Speed Freaks is basically an orc Twisted Metal clone that I really can't wait for a proper release for, because good god did I enjoy the beta. Damn shame I didn't capture any footage of it. And Daka Squadron is a dogfighting flight simulator, which is pretty good. Speaking as a guy whose only experience in the flight sim genre is Snoopy vs. the Red Baron, I'm getting a lot of Snoopy vs. the Red Baron vibes from it. But neither of those are the games I want to talk about today. Instead, I want to talk about a little side-scrolling shooter by the name of Shootas Blood and Teef. Developed and published by Rogueside, Shootas Blood and Teef is a side-scrolling shooter in a similar vein to Metal Slug and Contra. But if we're being honest with ourselves, it's basically just a reskin of Rogueside's own side-scrolling shooter, Guns, Gore, and Cannoli. I mean, even the name is just a reskin of Guns, Gore, and Cannoli. It's pretty blatant, guys. I know this isn't the most recent 40k game, and certainly there's newer ones I could talk about, but recently I sort of fell down a side-scrolling shooter rabbit hole and became weirdly captivated by this game, for both good and bad reasons, and I kinda just really want to talk about it. So grab your Shootas Blood and Teef, as we dive into Shootas Blood and Teef. Before we start, we're able to choose both an orc clan, which is just cosmetic, as well as a class, which has actual gameplay effects. I went with a Death Skulls Flash Kit, since I played Death Skulls on tabletop, and I think Flash Kit is kind of the way that this game was intended to be played. However, you can also play as a Beast Snagga who throws spears, a Weird Boy who can shoot off psychic blasts, or a Storm Boy who has a rocket-assisted dash. Something I want to touch on really quick is that this is one of those games that whenever you start a new game, it doesn't get rid of any of the progression or unlocks from the previous playthrough, which has a nasty consequence of completely killing the difficulty curve like it left its car running in the garage. This didn't really affect my opinion of it on replaying, but it's still something to just keep in mind. Starting the game, we are quickly introduced to the planet this game will be taking place on, Luteus. Oh, sorry, Luteus. And we meet our protagonist, Gargaz Teefgrabba, a bad moon who is about as orky as an orc can get, as well as being the third in a weird trend of orc protagonists being bad moons. We also meet our antagonist, Warboss Gutrekka, who wants our hair squig because he read one too many articles on the newsphere about going bald and now thinks it's over for him. After a quick scuffle with our Warboss because he won't hand over the hair squig, we are ejected from his ship and thrown into the wreckage of an Imperial cruiser, which serves as our tutorial level. Right off the bat, I want to praise this game's visual design because I think it works absurdly well for this game. I love the way this game looks because no other 40k game looks like this, so it immediately stands out in a crowd. Basically, every single 40k game has gone for a realistic aesthetic, well, as realistic as Warhammer gets anyway, except for something like Tacticus, but even then it's still clearly modeled on the actual physical models that Games Workshop produces. To be clear, I'm fine with this, and I get why the games tend to go for more realistic looking environments. The realistic graphics sort of help to sell the grim setting of Warhammer better, and I don't think that a 40k game that looks like TF2 would really work out all too well, although now that I say it out loud. But the point is that so many 40k games look visually identical, so much so it can be hard to tell them apart at a glance. To some of you diehards with hours in each game, you can probably do it, but at a glance, the average person is probably going to be having one hell of a hard time telling Dawn of War apart from Battle Sector apart from Sanctus Reach. So much so that you probably didn't realize that none of those games mentioned used the correct screenshots. It's nice to see a 40k game that's able to eschew the sort of traditional realistic art style that 40k goes for, but is still recognizably Warhammer. The stylistic flourishes are all there, just a little more cartoony than usual. Anyway, we fight through the wreckage with very little issue and move on to fighting through a neighboring orc encampment as well. After that, we reach the first boss of the game and pretty much the entirety of the marketing, the Goth Rocka Band. Oh, and there's also a knob there too, I guess. If there's one thing that everyone remembers from this game, it's this orc concert. And the other guy, but we'll get to that later. But let's talk about this orc concert for right now. It's goofy, it's fun, it's honestly kinda badass, it's perfectly orc. It also gives me a springboard to talk about how good the music in this game is. Dion Van Heerden knocked it out of the park with this game, going for a sort of speed metal sound to the music. It's like something out of Motorhead, and I keep half expecting Lemmy to show up out of nowhere and start spitting something unintelligible over it. What I really appreciate though is that he recorded both a high intensity and low intensity version of every single track, save for the boss tracks, obviously. So that way, music can actually match what's happening on the screen, and you don't have sick, nasty guitar riffs going off while you're standing around doing nothing. Anyway, with the knob dead and an encampment full of boys on our side, we finally begin the siege on the Hive City, believing in there we'll find a way to reach Warboss Gutrekka. For as simple as it may be, the intro to the siege is probably my favorite way that a level starts in this game. You just have a swarm of orc boys around you and get to just rush forward in a proper wah. Now, the mob does tend to die pretty quickly and they don't really stick around for the rest of the level, but for some reason it really left an impression on me. Maybe it's because I'm used to shoving hordes of boys at my opponents on the table, or maybe I just appreciated having a meat shield. Either way, I just thought it was really neat. The siege itself is also pretty fun, storming Imperial Guard lines and wreaking havoc behind them. You gotta avoid these areas where mortar strikes are coming in, and it isn't really that hard to do, but I do appreciate the fact that it's there. It seems like the guard are at least sort of prepped for this possibility rather than, just being blindsided. Something I really like is that if you can get to them, you can pick up the guardsmen's weapon emplacements and use them against the Imperials, which is really fun. But also, during the siege, I found the wimpiest sounding heavy bolter I have ever heard in my entire life. Good God, and people complained about the original Dawn of War bolter sounding anemic. I've hit someone with pillows that have had more impact than this. Speaking of the Imperials, we get a pretty good spread of enemies throughout the siege. It's mostly guardsmen, but we also see some units I really wasn't expecting. Ogren are a pleasant surprise. Love to see the big lovable brutes. A little sad I have to crump them, but hey, that's just how shit goes sometimes. I'm sure they get it. Rattling snipers are also here. Sure, they die to a light breeze, but they're here. And I mean, hey, I wasn't expecting to see rattlings in anything anytime soon. And that includes games of 40k. Pressing forward, we eventually get to our first major boss fight, which is introduced with another cutscene that's just really good.
Vile Xenos! How dare you profane the sacred territory of the Imperium of Man!
Oh, never mind that, you me. I's got a deal for ya. Give us your dagger, and I won't rip your head off!
While there aren't too many cutscenes, I really appreciate that they're mostly all focused on taking the wind out of the sails of other factions. Gargaz doesn't seem to treat these serious threats with the gravitas they deserve, and appears either bored or amused by their self-important ramblings. And honestly, there's nothing better than seeing a self-important Imperial be denied the respect they think they deserve. Our first boss fight is against a Baneblade, the Bastion of Valor, and it is pretty good. Not great, but pretty good. There's a good variety of attacks, and the second phase shakes up the fight enough to keep it interesting. You gotta jump over the Baneblade as it charges over after you destroyed its main battle cannon, but it is a little bit too easy. I feel like this fight is more about the spectacle, though. More about being able to say, the second boss you fight in this game is a Baneblade, rather than actually being a challenging fight. And ultimately, I think the spectacle of it is enough to make up for the slightly lackluster boss design and difficulty. And I think that it's a fine boss to end what I'd call the first act of this game. Following the Baneblade fight, we get into what I'm generously calling the second act of this game. And for me, this is where it kind of goes into a bit of a slump. The entire midsection of this game I just do not find as enjoyable as the rest of it. It doesn't really take a nosedive, but it's where I felt the game hit some turbulence and dropped in altitude. If there's a low point of the game, it is this collection of levels. I think the biggest issue is that these levels just kind of get really uninteresting in their theming and lack any real variety. Consider the levels of Act 1. You started out in a crashed spaceship, then moved on to an orc encampment, before charging the Imperial Guard emplacements on the wall of the Hive City. And then, after that, you were behind enemy lines. Each level had a variety of visuals and their own elements to make them memorable. So how does Act 2 follow that up? By making the levels only have two themes, sewer and oil refinery. Sewer levels are already one of the most common tropes in gaming. So much so that a certain convict suffering extrajudicial punishment under the New Mexico desert has a whole bit dedicated to cataloging them. But I'd like to nominate refinery/factory levels for the second most used level trope in gaming. Hell, if I wanted to, I could start my own count for factory levels if I was some sort of hack fraud. And lucky us, we get to have these level tropes back to back. Oh boy. I sure hope you guys like going from a bunch of indistinct green pipes and pools of poison sewage to a bunch of indistinct red pipes and pools of flammable oil. Holy shit, reel back on the creativity there, Rogue Side, before someone has a fucking aneurysm. Speaking of crap theming, instead of fighting more Guard, we've now moved on to fighting Genestealer cults, which are for the most part just a reskin of the Guard. There's the Neophyte cultists and the Brood Brothers making up the majority of the basic combatants. Though the Neophytes with autoguns deal a surprising amount of damage, but I can't help but feel like the cultists are a bit of a wasted opportunity, just for how similar they are to fighting the Imperial Guard. The only enemy that the Genestealers have that really sets them apart are the Acolyte hybrids. Two of them, in fact, one with a det pack and another with a bunch of knives. The det pack one is a total pushover. He can yeet bombs at you and shoot at you with his little pew-pew, but I swear his throwing arc is a set distance. Like, I've lost count of the amount of times he's thrown a det pack at me and it either comes up comically short or sails right over my head. The knife guy, though, I actually like. He has this pounce attack that lets him close the gap with you, so it's a lot more difficult to keep him out of melee range. You have to actually think when you fight him. I like it. It's a shame I can't say the same for the Pure Strain Genestealer, who is a total pushover, and the best demonstration of this game's kind of crappy enemy AI. Yeah, enemies generally have very little regard for their own survival, and most of the time just make a beeline for you, walking into any fire or hazards that may be in their way. So why not make the enemies smarter and give them some more maneuverability? Well, the Genestealer is why. See, the Genestealer is clearly an attempt to make an enemy with unpredictable movement patterns and some intelligence behind where it's going to move. And I'll give the game this, the Genestealer certainly moves in a manner that is unpredictable. Probably not in the way they intended, though. See, I don't think the engine was really built for what they were trying to do with the Genestealer, so effectively it just gives you an enemy that has a seizure for a little bit, then gets caught on a piece of level geometry and dies. But it's still less buggy than Space Hulk Deathwing, so, good job on your Genestealer, B- overall, keep up the good work. But in my opinion, nothing else compares to the lowest point of this act, which is, unfortunately, the boss fight. This fight pits you against a Genestealer Patriarch, which should be really cool. The key word there being should be, because oh my god, is this fight so boring. This fight follows my least favorite trope, which is fight the boss for a phase, and then fight some enemies. It just makes the fight feel like filler. Like, oh, you gotta eat your vegetables before you can have your dessert. It's a boss fight. It's supposed to be a fun send-off to the act that tests your skills. Why do I have to do paperwork for it? Yeah, every time I walk into a boss arena, I go, oh gee, I sure can't wait to fight the same unthreatening mooks I've been mowing through for the rest of the act. You wanna know the worst part about it, man? The Patriarch isn't even fun to fight. How do you fuck that up? It's a Patriarch! It moves so slow, and it is so easy to dodge its attacks. And besides the Gene Stealer making a beeline for you and trying to swipe at you, the only thing else in this arena that you have to look out for are these purple projectiles that float around, and float around so slow that they're not even an issue to dodge. Oh, but look out! Every time you go into a new phase, it gets a new projectile. Oh my god, it must be Christmas! Look, I get after fighting a Baneblade as the first act boss. Anything else is gonna kinda pale in comparison, but you could have at least made this fight a little bit more interesting. But on the bright side, after the Patriarch fight, I think the game does take a significant upswing. Killing the Patriarch severed the psychic connection to the rest of the cult and caused the uprising to happen early, so now you have to get out of there as everything crumbles around you. And doing so leads to what I think is kind of a cool level, where you have to run through a previous level backwards, but everything's kind of collapsing, so previously closed off areas are now open. So it isn't just the same level but reversed, it's the same level but reversed, and new areas are added, which I can't be completely mad at. I do kind of like this one a lot. I like it a lot, but for as negative as I've been, I do have to admit, Act 2 does end on a pretty high note. The third act is honestly much better than the midsection of the game, and where it really starts to pick up some of that steam that it lost from earlier. The act begins with the premature cult uprising and features both a presence of the Imperial Guard from earlier alongside the Gene Stealer cults, and the two factions actually do some infighting. It's neat to see the two factions going at it while you kind of just tear a swath of violence across them. And I also really like seeing the whole mix of Gene Stealer and Imperial stuff out here in the ruined bits of the Hive City. The level ends on a bit of a weird note though, which is a Sentinel boss fight that I am 98% sure is supposed to be a joke, since at this point we've killed a Leman Russ, a Baneblade, and a Gene Stealer Patriarch. What is a Sentinel going to do to us? I mean, yeah, I still died to it, but still. Castellum Luteus is what I'm calling the first real level of Act 3, as it's where we're introduced to the new main enemies of this part, the Space Marines. Not Ultramarines, surprisingly. White Scars, which is fairly surprising to see. I feel like we don't really see a lot of the White Scars in anything, really. They certainly seem like one of the more forgotten about first founding chapters, which, if you're a fan of the White Scars, it must kind of suck to see them getting killed in the only media representation they've had. So, sorry. If it makes you feel any better, I think they're one of the more fun enemies to fight. They have a good tendency to move and shoot rather than just stand still like most other enemies tend to do. So they sort of wind up fitting in with the kind of run-and-gun nature of the game because, you know, they run and gun, which is fitting for the White Scars, whose tactics are run and gun. Huh, good job, Rogueside. Anyway, moving on to the next level. What's that? I'm forgetting an enemy? No, I'm not. I can't forget them, because I see them constantly in my nightmares, the Tempestus Scions. Oh my god, this is what hell is like. Guardsmen that can take more punishment and fire guns that deal more damage with a faster moving projectile. Oh my god. And if that wasn't deadly enough, they can also come to battle rocking a plasma gun that I swear lops off a good fifth of your health with a single shot. They're not as common as the regular guardsmen, but they are far more prevalent than I'd like them to be. They're not the most annoying enemy in the game, but they are absolutely the most terrifying. I start panicking whenever I see these guys. Anyway, this level ends with a boss fight against a chaplain and two of his cronies. Hot tip, don't stand in front of the door with low health like I did unless you want to die instantly. Aside from me being an idiot, he really isn't too hard. Just keep going from one side to the other and it'll drop like a sack of wet progenoid glands. Also, the level kind of just keeps going for a bit after the boss, and I really don't know why. I guess they just really wanted to squeeze in this Doctor Strangelove reference, so instead of ending on a cool boss fight, the level ends after a small gauntlet of enemies. Moving on to Voidport Hangar, this level is kind of just unremarkable, but for some reason I had one hell of a hard time with the start of it. I just died over and over and over again, and here's a supercut of that so you can all laugh at me. The real standout moment for this level is an elevator section where it stops and you have to fight waves of various enemies, ultimately culminating in a fight with an Invictor tactical warsuit that feels like it should be more difficult than it is, but it is surprisingly easy, though the warsuit does get a cool cowboy hip draw, so that is very much worth noting. Also, complete side tangent, but this fight made me realize that I have literally never seen an Invictor warsuit painted in any colors besides the GW default ultramarine blue, so it felt kind of wrong for me to see it in White Scar's regalia in a way that I can't really describe. It's like seeing a color-swapped version of the Mario Brothers. Like, yeah, you can do it, but why? But after scrapping the Not Dreadnought, we move on to the next Oh. This level also just keeps going on after its boss fight. Huh. Really hope that isn't foreshadowing anything. But after all that, we move on to the one part of this game that literally everyone remembers. I will let him introduce himself.
Attention, Orc! You face Lord Horik Canorum, son of High King Valeric Canorum, High Prince of House Canorum, Master of the Blade of Gaia, Keeper of the Gates of Loralo, Wielder of the Caloric Flame, Bringer of Hope, Herald of the Holy Order of the Adamantine Lance, the Paladin of Koto, Slayer of the Lion of Essa, the Triumphant, the Light of Stars, the Eradicator. You what?
Lord Horik Canorum, son of High King Valeric Canorum, High Prince of House Canorum, Master of the Blade of Gaia, Keeper of the Gates of Loralo, Wielder of the Caloric Flame, Bringer of Hope, Herald of the Holy Order of the Adamantine Lance, the Paladin of Koto, Slayer of the Lion of Essa, the Triumphant, the Light of Stars, the Eradicator. First take is the best boss in this game, and probably the most memorable and iconic thing to come out of Shootas Blood and Teef. The fight itself isn't very hard, but oh my god is it memorable. For one, it just has the wow factor of fighting an Imperial Knight. This is how you top fighting a Baneblade as your first boss. On top of that, this is by far the most interactivity we've seen between the boss and the stage that it's on. See, the stage scrolls backwards as Lord Horik advances towards you, firing off all his weaponry, and you have to use stage elements to take cover from some attacks that take up most of the screen. The stage is more than just a backdrop in this fight, it's as integral as the player or Lord Horik himself. The level of interplay between the player, the stage, and the boss kinda helps to make up for the fact that, in actuality, this is kinda just a pretty underwhelming boss fight. I mean, you just gotta dump shots into Lord Horik enough for his shield to drop, and then take off his health, do that 3 times, and the fight's over. It's not even really that long of a boss fight, but it's an incredibly memorable one because of how everything kinda just meshes. A boss like this reminds me of some of the bosses from Metal Slug that are equal parts boss and part of the stage. Lord Horik is an excellent fight, the high watermark of the game, in my opinion, and makes for a fantastic, memorable final note for this game to end on. Except this isn't the final boss, there's still 2 levels left. Okay, so this is a bit of a problem with this game. Much like a disappointing date, it climaxes too early. Something like Lord Horik Canorum would have been a great note to end the game on, but for some reason it just keeps going through 2 more levels, and one more final for real this time, no take-backsies boss fight. Hijacking a White Scar's Thunderhawk, we fly up to the Goghammer, Warboss Gutrekka's flagship, which is split across 2 fairly long levels, I think the longest ones in the game. Much like the first few levels of the game, we are back to fighting orcs as our primary enemies, but instead of goths, they're bad moons now, so I hope you like fighting orcs again. I also hope you really liked that Knob boss fight from the beginning of the game, because the game really liked it, and they're just a common enemy now. Oh, and they have big Shootas too, as well. I do like fighting the Knobs, but I was a little surprised it took the game this long to bring out the old previous boss as now a common enemy tactic, but I like the previous bosses far more than these new mini-bosses, the Killa-Cans. These guys are just so damn annoying to fight. They fire off missiles that track you, and the way they fire them off makes it really difficult to not get hit by them. They're just high enough that it's difficult to jump over them, and just low enough that you can't really run underneath them. They also take a ridiculous amount of punishment to put down for mini-bosses. Oh my god. Like, if these were level-end bosses, I'd have no issue with them. But for something in the middle of a level, these guys are just a chore to mop up. Oh, and if you thought one of them was bad, oh, well, get ready to fight two. Now, as much as I'm grumbling about the game still going on, I do like the Gog Hammer. It has this fun gravity mechanic in some parts, and it's cool to see the inside of an orc cruiser, even if it is a somewhat abstracted view of it like this is. I particularly really like Gutrekka's treasure room, where you can see things taken from other factions that he's bested. The guy even has a suit of Custodes armor. That's right, Gutrekka has canonically killed a custodian, which, given the rules in their latest codex, may not be that much of an achievement anymore. Anyway, following a brief fight on the ship's bridge, we're then dropped into the lower decks and activate the ship's self-destruct feature. And then after that, it's on to the final fight of the game, War Boss Gutrekka. But this is not just a one-on-one fight, no. Gutrekka has got himself a Stompa. So now we've moved on to something that's bigger than a Baneblade and bigger than an Imperial Knight. So this boss has some excellent setup. Too bad the execution for it kind of really sucks. You just gotta unload fire into Gutrekka until he retreats into his Stompa, and then unload fire into the boiler. You do that 3 times and he's dusted. The only difficulty I had with this fight is that my game crashed on my first attempt at recording it. With Gutrekka killed and his hair squig back on his scalp, Gargaz realizes that taking out Gutrekka now makes him the WoW's new war boss, something that he's at least excited about.
I'll call it War Teef Grabber. Yeah, I likes the sound of that.
And that's it, that's your lot, that's Shootas, Blood and Teef, get out of my house. So, do I recommend this game? Well, it's complicated. I do think it's a good game, but I have one big problem with it that really stops me from wholeheartedly recommending it. So, remember earlier when I said I was weirdly captivated by this game? Well, the reason for that is because when I played this game when it first came out, I remember really enjoying it. But upon replaying it, I wound up feeling like it really did not hold up. But I couldn't pinpoint why. I mean, the gameplay is good, the humor is fairly funny, the visuals are great, and the music is fantastic, but something just held it back, and I think I finally know what it was. This game has 0 replay value. Shootas, Blood and Teef is going to take you about 2.5, maybe 3 hours to see everything this game has, and there's really nothing to do besides the main campaign and a versus mode that I didn't bother to get footage of. Once you finish the campaign, that's it. That's everything. No new difficulty, no new game modes, no new weapons, nothing. You can't even reset your save to have to unlock the weapons again so you can have a fresh start with a new campaign. The only thing you get for beating the game is a hair squig hat, so there's no real reason to even play the campaign again, which honestly isn't too much of a problem. I mean, I don't have an issue with games that are shorter in their length, and not every game has to go on forever. The issue is that Rogueside is asking almost $20 for this game. $30 if you get the soundtrack. $20 for a game this content light is frankly obscene, especially when it's such a one-and-done type game like this one. Something like a new very hard difficulty, or maybe like a one life mode for the campaign, may have given even just a little bit of reason to play it again and slightly justify the price. But again, there's nothing to do once you beat the game, and call me crazy, but I feel like how much a game costs should at least reflect the amount of content actually on offer. For the $20 Shootas, Blood and Teef is asking for, you can get both Metal Slug X and Metal Slug 3, which are, in my opinion, the finest 2D shooters ever made. Beautiful sprite work, amazing enemy and level design, and just enough difficulty to be fun rather than frustrating. Metal Slug 3 in particular has a lot of replay value thanks to its levels having a lot of branching paths within them, meaning that every playthrough is at least a little bit different than the previous one. But if for whatever reason you're stuck with a debilitating disease where the only cure is to give Rogueside about $20 for a side-scrolling shooter, 1, that's oddly specific, I hope you're okay, and 2, you can also pick up Guns, Gore, and Cannoli 1 and 2 for like $2 more than Shootas, Blood and Teef. Yeah, that's right. You can essentially get twice the content this game offers in the same genre from the same company for the same price. And it's effectively the same game, just with an Italian coat of paint instead of Warhammer. I think a good price point for this game would have been like $10. At that price, I would give this an easy recommendation, but I think that outside of a sale, this game is just way too expensive to completely wholeheartedly recommend. If you're into orcs, or you liked Rogueside's previous games and just want more of that, then sure, pick it up now. But for everyone else, wait for a sale or a price drop. The latter of which I'm not too sure is coming because it's been 2 years and the game is still $20. I mean, does Rogueside seriously expect Warhammer fans to pay full price for something insubstantial that came out years ago and probably won't see any support or updates anytime soon? Don't answer that.